The sky was the color of ash as the town settled into evening, its wooden bones creaking beneath the weight of wind and silence. Dust rose in lazy spirals, turning the last light of day into a faded lantern glow. On the edge of the street, bound to a weathered post that once held horses but now held her, a young woman slumped forward. Her skin was pale from hunger and exhaustion, her dress torn at the hem and stained with earth. To those who passed her by, she looked less like a person than a shadow unraveling. She was 24, poor, beautiful in the quiet way a wildflower is beautiful even as boots trample it, and helpless before the eyes of those who would not see. They watched her, though most pretended not to. A merchant's wife quickened her pace, skirts gathered, as if poverty were a disease that might leap from flesh to fabric. Two men leaned against the saloon rail, murmuring with smirks, their laughter brittle with cruelty. Even children stared wide-eyed before their mothers tugged them away. The whole town seemed to agree upon one unspoken truth, that this woman had been judged and found wanting, and whatever fate awaited her, they would not intervene. She had not spoken in hours. Her lips, dry as old paper, parted only to draw shallow breaths. Inside her, memories played like faded lantern slides. Once she had known laughter, soft and ringing, in a home that smelled of bread and wood smoke. Once she had been promised a future, a man's hand clasping hers, the hope of a farm that would grow with their love. But drought had taken the fields, sickness had claimed her parents, and the man, her first promise, had revealed himself not as savior but coward. He had left her with debts and whispers that spread faster than fire. And now here she sat, abandoned in the open, left for shame to finish what hunger and despair had begun. The worst wound was not the hunger nor the ropes, but the silence. The silence of neighbors who had once broken bread with her parents. The silence of those who had shared her childhood streets. Their refusal to look at her fully was sharper than any knife. They all watch me die, she thought, her spirit fraying thread by thread. Her head dipped, heavy as stone. The dust swirled higher, catching in her throat. She could almost believe she was already gone. Her soul half slipped from her body. The town blurred into shifting shapes, faces that looked and looked away, hands that twitched but never reached. She might have closed her eyes for the last time if not for the sound of hooves, steady and unhurried, entering the street. From the dim horizon came a rider. His figure was outlined in the copper glow of sunset, tall in the saddle, moving with the kind of quiet certainty that drew notice without asking for it. As he approached, dust parted around his horse's steps, as though the earth itself recognized the weight he carried. He was a man of 34, rich in the measure of land and cattle, strong in the set of his shoulders, handsome in the way of men who do not know or need to prove it. Yet none of these details mattered to her fading eyes. What she saw first was steadiness, the absence of hurry or disdain. He guided his horse closer, and the townsfolk shifted uneasily. Some glanced down at their boots, some smirked as though waiting for a spectacle, and others crossed their arms, already rehearsing their disapproval. But the rider gave them no notice. His gaze, clear as river water, fell upon the woman bound to the post. He saw the ropes cutting her skin, the droop of her head, the whisper of breath that seemed ready to stop. And unlike the others, he did not turn away. The woman felt the shadow of his horse fall across her, a shade that cooled the burning of her shame. For a moment she did not dare lift her eyes. Better to believe he would ride past, like all the others. Better to remain unseen than to hope again. Yet something in the stillness compelled her, and slowly she raised her gaze. Their eyes met. There was no pity in his expression, no mockery, no calculation. Only a quiet recognition, as though he were not meeting a fallen woman, but another soul weathered by storms. She tried to form words, but her throat gave only a rasp. Still in her heart, something shifted, faint as the first stir of wind before rain. He dismounted with unhurried grace, boots pressing into dust. The murmur of the crowd thickened, curiosity threading with discomfort. He knelt before her, close enough that she could smell the leather of his vest, the faint scent of horse and pine. His hands, roughened by rains and work, reached for the knots binding her. Each tug was deliberate, patient, as if he were unbinding not just rope, but the verdict the town had laid upon her. The silence deepened. Even the saloon music faltered, a single note stretching too long before breaking. Eyes fixed upon him, upon her, upon the act of undoing what everyone else had accepted. Her wrists loosened, pins and needles rushing through them as blood returned. She flinched at the sensation, ashamed of her weakness, yet overwhelmed by the gentleness of his touch. Tears pricked, but did not fall. She had thought herself emptied of tears. Why would he do this? Why would a man like him, wealthy, strong, unburdened, lower himself to untie a woman whose own town had abandoned her? The question beat in her chest louder than her own heart. Her lips trembled, and at last words scraped their way free. They came not as a cry, but as a whisper, faint as wind slipping through cracked shutters. They all watched me die. His hand stilled on the last knot, his eyes lifting to hers. For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Dust hovered midair, the crowd frozen. The sunset paused in its descent. And then he pulled the final rope loose. Her arms fell forward into his waiting grasp, and for the first time in what felt like years, she was held, not by duty, not by cruelty, but by choice. His grip was steady, grounding her as the last of her restraints slipped into the dirt. The murmurs swelled around them, disbelieving, scandalized, uncertain. She swayed in his arms, her voice breaking again, softer, rawer than before. "They all watched me die," she whispered. "But you?" Her breath caught. The words would not finish themselves, but the silence that followed was louder than any conclusion. His presence beside her, the ropes at their feet, and the eyes of the whole town upon them were enough. The cowboy lifted her gently, as though carrying something sacred. Gasps rippled through the street. For the first time since her fall, she felt the tremor of possibility, dangerous, fragile, yet alive. He turned from the crowd, her weight secure against his chest, and began to walk. The world around them seemed to split in two, those who had watched and the one who had acted. Her pulse beat wildly in her ears, the echo of a life she had thought extinguished. She pressed her face weakly against his shoulder, her voice barely a breath against him. Why? The question floated into the dusk, unanswered. His silence was not empty, but full, a promise hanging unspoken in the air. And as the last light of day bled into shadow, she realized that whatever came next would not be what the town expected. It would be something unthinkable. The night fell like velvet stitched with stars, and the town's noise faded into a restless hush. He carried her past the saloon lights, past the whispers that clung to every shadowed corner, until only the steady thud of his boots and the rhythm of his breath remained. She was cradled against him, weak but aware of the firm steadiness in his arms. Each step jolted her aching body, yet each step also tethered her back to the world she thought she had left. He brought her not to the fine house the townsfolk imagined a man of his wealth might keep, but to a cabin set on the fringe of town, half hidden by cottonwoods. Its walls were simple, built for shelter rather than pride, and inside lingered the scent of cedar smoke and leather oil. He lowered her onto a cot near the fire, where flames snapped softly and cast golden light upon the hollows of her face. She trembled, unused to warmth, and a shame crept into her chest as though she did not deserve it. He did not speak at once. Instead, he moved with unhurried care, setting a kettle upon the fire, finding a blanket thick enough to shield her thin shoulders. His silence was not cold but steady, as though words could wait until she could hold them. She studied him through half-lidded eyes. His features were cut in quiet lines, a strength born of labor, not vanity. His hands, large and rough, handled the blanket as if it were lace. When at last he broke the silence, his voice was low, shaped by patience rather than demand. "You need food," he said, "and rest." No other judgments followed. No questions about her ruin, no accusations about her past. Only the recognition of her need, as simple and unadorned as bread. The first spoonful of broth scalded her tongue, and she nearly wept. The taste was plain, but to her hollow body it was sweeter than any feast she could recall. He watched only long enough to be sure she would take another, then turned his gaze back to the fire, granting her the dignity of eating without scrutiny. That small mercy shook her more than any grand gesture could. She wanted to speak, yet her voice stumbled in her throat. At last, she whispered that she did not deserve his kindness. Her life was already wasted, her name already dirt beneath the town's boots. Why would he trouble himself with her? He looked at her then, and his gaze held no pity. "They were blind," he said, "but I am not blind." The words struck deeper than any sermon. Blind. Yes, that was the truth of it. The town had seen only her fall, never her fight to rise again. They had watched her crumble without remembering the girl she had been, the woman she still was beneath the ruin. And here was a man who did not avert his eyes. Still, fear clung to her like burrs. She remembered too well the first man, the one who had once taken her hand with promises soft as spring rain. He had turned cold when her father's debts swallowed the farm, when her family's land dried to dust. To him she had become a burden, a weight that dragged his pride into mud. He had left her with only words sharp enough to scar her forever. If one man could change so swiftly, why should she trust another? The cowboy did not press her. His quiet was a shelter in which she could breathe. Yet she sensed the tension outside those cabin walls. The town would not ignore what he had done. Already whispers sharpened into knives. She had seen the way their faces twisted, their disbelief, their scorn. To them, his choice was folly, a stain upon his name. She feared what they might do, not only to her, but to him. That fear deepened when, days later, the first man returned. He came swaggering down the lane toward the cabin, voice dripping with mockery. He called her names too cruel for children to hear, laughed at the thought of her being lifted by someone so far above her ruin. He demanded to know why a man of wealth would dirty his hands with broken things. She shrank back, memories of his betrayal tightening her chest. But the cowboy stood at the door, his broad frame filling the space, silent as stone. He did not trade insults, did not raise his fists. His silence itself was a shield, steady enough to unnerve the other man. After a long moment of sneering, the shallow-hearted one spat into the dirt and stormed away, leaving behind only the sour stench of pride wounded. She watched in awe, not because the cowboy had fought, but because he had not needed to. Strength, she realized, was not always in the fist, but in the refusal to bend to cruelty. He had carried her once from death's edge, and now he carried her again in the dignity of restraint. Time in the cabin softened into rhythm. The older widow who lived near the well brought broth each evening, setting it down without fuss, her eyes warm but wordless. A stable boy left sprigs of wildflowers on the sill, running before she could thank him. Small kindnesses, offered without judgment, stitched into her soul like fragile threads mending a torn cloth. Her body grew stronger, her voice steadier, but inside her heart, storms still roamed. Each time she thought of stepping beyond the cabin, she heard again the laughter of the crowd, felt again the burn of their silence as she withered on that post. The cowboy never pushed her to leave. He only sat near the fire at dusk, polishing tack or carving wood, his presence patient, his quiet saying more than words could. One night, unable to keep silence any longer, she asked him why. Why he had stopped, why he had lifted her when the world had already turned away. He set aside the piece of wood, studied the grain of the fire, and answered in a tone soft but certain. Because you are alive, and because no one deserves to be left bound and unseen. She could not reply. Her throat swelled. Her chest ached with the unfamiliar weight of being valued. Tears slipped unbidden, hot trails down her cheeks, not of sorrow, but of something like release. Yet as she drifted to sleep that night, another sound carried faintly through the window, the distant murmur of townsfolk gathering, their voices sharpened by resentment. The whispers were no longer confined to shadows. They were swelling into threat. She knew they would not let this stand, this act that defied their judgment. Her eyes opened to the flicker of firelight, and dread chilled her blood. She turned toward the cowboy, who sat steady in his chair, as though expecting the storm to come. He met her gaze, and though he said nothing, His eyes held a promise she could not yet name. She understood then that the ropes he had cut were not the only chains binding her. Outside, the town was tightening its grip, preparing to drag her back into shame. Inside, her spirit wavered between fear and the fragile stirrings of hope. And in that fragile space, she wondered what unthinkable thing he might do when the town came knocking. Morning came with a brittle stillness, as if the town itself held its breath. The woman woke to the crackle of fire and the faint sound of boots shifting outside. She sat upright on the cot, her hands twisting the blanket, a knot of dread tightening inside her chest. The whispers that had once slithered through alleys had grown bolder, louder, until now they gathered in one place beyond the cabin door. The cowboy stood at the window, his frame outlined by pale dawn. He had not slept. She could see it in the heaviness of his shoulders, the way his eyes lingered on the horizon. Yet his presence carried no fear. He looked like a man preparing not for battle, but for truth. By mid-morning, the voices outside had swelled into a crowd. The town had assembled, faces hard, eyes sharp with judgment. The shallow-hearted man stood at the front, his pride festering into venom. He called out accusations, his voice ringing with the confidence of one who knew the crowd shared his disdain. "She is cursed," he shouted. "She is a stain, a ruin. And this man, this so-called cowboy, has bound himself to her shame." Each word struck her like stones. She curled into herself, wishing she could vanish. The cabin felt smaller with every cry that rose from outside. They would never let her live. She had thought herself dead once, and now it seemed the town would see it done properly. The cowboy turned from the window. His eyes met hers, steady and unyielding, and for a moment the noise outside dimmed. He crossed the room, crouched beside her, and took her trembling hand in his. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Do not let them decide your worth. You are more than what they see." Tears burned her eyes, but she nodded, unable to speak. She felt the calluses of his palm, the unshakable steadiness in his grip, and for the first time she believed he might be right. The door opened, not with haste, but with calm resolve. Light spilled across the floorboards, and he stepped into it, pulling her gently to her feet. The crowd hushed, a sea of eyes fastening upon them. She wanted to shrink back, but his hand held hers firm, grounding her in the storm. The shallow-hearted man smirked, sensing his victory. "Go on then," he jeered. "Defend her if you dare. Tell us why we should bear the burden of her ruin." The cowboy's silence stretched long enough to still the murmurs. When he spoke, his voice carried with the weight of rivers carving stone. "You all watched her die," he said. "You watched and did nothing." His gaze swept over the crowd, sharp as sunlight. "Your silence was the rope around her wrists. Your pride the gallows. Not hers. Yours." The words struck like a bell. The townsfolk shifted uneasily, eyes darting, some lowering their heads. A few crossed their arms tighter, unwilling to yield, but shame rippled through the gathering. The truth had been spoken aloud, undeniable in its simplicity. The shallow-hearted man barked a laugh, brittle and hollow. "And what would you have us do? Pretend she is whole again? Pretend she is worth the place she has taken?" The cowboy stepped forward, his hand still entwined with hers. "Not pretend," he answered. "See her as she is. Alive, brave, worth more than every coward who turned away." The woman's knees weakened, her breath faltered. She had dreamed of such words, but never dared believe them. In front of all who condemned her, he stood not as rescuer, but as witness. He lifted her hand, not to display her shame, but to honor it, to show the scars, and say they did not diminish her. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some muttered, others fell silent, but all eyes remained fixed upon the pair. She felt the world tilt beneath her, the weight of years of silence breaking open. For the first time since her fall, she straightened her back. Her voice trembled, yet carried enough to reach those nearest. "You all watched me die." The crowd shifted again, uneasy. Her throat closed, but she forced the words onward. "And now you will watch me live." The shallow-hearted man spat into the dust, rage twisting his face. He cursed them both, vowing that the town would never forget her ruin. But his voice no longer rang with authority. It cracked under the weight of the silence that followed. He stormed away, his boots striking hard against the earth, leaving behind only the bitterness of his own defeat. The people did not cheer. There was no sudden chorus of redemption. But the eyes that had once turned away now lingered, some softened, some ashamed. The widow at the well stepped forward, pressing a hand to her chest in quiet respect. The stable boy, half hidden in the back, placed another wildflower on the ground. Small gestures, fragile beginnings, but beginnings nonetheless. The woman's chest ached with release. Tears blurred her vision, but these were not the tears of despair she had known. They were the tears of one who had been buried and found breath again. She turned to the cowboy, her lips trembling with gratitude too vast for words. He only inclined his head, his silence again speaking more than any vow could. In his eyes she saw not pity but recognition, the unshakable truth that she was no longer invisible. She was seen alive, worthy. The crowd began to disperse, their murmurs trailing into distance. The square emptied until only dust remained, swirling like spirits in the sun. She leaned against him, her body weak, but her spirit standing taller than it had in years. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, embers glowing faintly. She sank onto the cot, her heart still pounding from the storm. He stood near the door, his hand resting against the frame, shoulders heavy but unbroken. For a long time neither spoke. At last she whispered, her voice fragile but firm, "You did the unthinkable." He turned, the faintest shadow of a smile touching his lips. "No," he said softly. "You did." Her breath caught, a sob rising that broke into quiet laughter. The truth of it settled over her like sunlight. She had spoken, she had stood, she had claimed her life again. The cowboy had given her the space, but she had taken the step. Night fell once more, wrapping the town in silence. The whispers would not vanish in a day, nor the scars of her past. But within her, something unshakable had shifted. She was no longer the woman left to die. She was the woman who had lived. And as she lay against the fire's glow, her heart steady for the first time in years, a question trembled at the edges of her thoughts. Not of fear this time, but of wonder. If this was what it meant to live again, what else might be possible?